all time? What do we think?
Pete, go ahead, man.
So I think the biggest problem with this whole discussion is whether you classify Steph Curry as a point guard, right? Like traditionally, is he as much of a point guard in the same sense that Magic Johnson is, right? And one of the things that makes this really hard for Steph is that Magic Johnson is kind of like the prototype, right? He is literally the archetypal point guard as far as basketball history is concerned. I think he would be number one. Isaiah Thomas is probably number two. We think of those guys, we think of point guards. But here's the thing. Like Steph Curry, it's got to be Steph. It's just got to be. I'm sorry. I love Magic. Magic is an incredible player. Steph Curry never, ever played. And this might be a diss to the Klay Thompsons and the Draymond Greens and the Kevin Durants of the world. I just don't think that even Steph Curry played with as good of people as Magic Johnson. Magic Johnson has a litany of Hall of Famers in his repertoire that he got to play with. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And mind you, Magic Johnson in a lot of ways extended Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's career. But Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was still a 38-year-old capable of, giving you 25 in finals games, right? So it's not like he was lifting him up by his bootstraps and making Kareem this guy that he otherwise wouldn't be, right? The reason I think it's Steph is just because Steph, of all players in the modern era, has changed the game the most. And I don't even think that's a discussion. There's nobody who has changed the sport of basketball as much as Steph Curry and really just defied the odds in terms of the size and the expectations of what he could be and just lifted a franchise up on his shoulders and created his own dynasty. You could say a lot of the same things about Magic Johnson. In a lot of ways, he actually saved the NBA more than even somebody like Michael Jordan did, just from a notoriety of the league standard. But I have to take Steph because I think if you imagine Steph on some of these teams that you think of Magic Johnson, like what is Steph with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, right? What even is that? That's an insane offensive team. Like there's nothing you can do against that team just based on the sheer versatility of where the shots are even coming from. You have two of the most unstoppable shots ever in the history of basketball. So I would say Steph is my number one point guard of all time at this point. He's in my top 10. I would probably go so far as to say he's like number 8 or 9 for me all time. He's like literally right next to Magic Johnson. I'd probably put him like one spot ahead of Magic. But just it's the length of the career that Steph is going to have too is not even relatively appreciated in this conversation. One of the things you said, Bernie, is interesting to me. Like you're saying we don't ever talk about Steph in the top 10. It's because he's in the middle of his career, Just in these last couple seasons, we've started talking about him in that way. And it's fair because that was the stage of the career he was in, or the stage of his career he was in at that point, right? But there's no way he doesn't age almost more gracefully than any other player before him, too. Just from his skill set. He's going to be able to do what he's doing for another 5 years, I think, personally. So imagine what his repertoire looks like at that point. Think of the fact that Magic Johnson, we're thinking of a guy who's had not only 30 years of letting it simmer what he did in the league, but also his whole career is up. So we have like a completely skewed perspective of what he is versus what Steph is. So I'm taking Steph. That's just me. What do you think, Brad?
I mean, I feel like it depends on how you define a point guard. Like if we're saying Steph is the best player to play the point guard position, that's not too crazy. You could go with Steph. But if we were actually talking like point guard, I would probably say it's between Magic and Chris Paul, like doing the things that a point guard does. Because Steph is really like, I mean, I know that text that Stephen A. Smith got from Michael Jordan was fake, but it was real. Like it like in the sense that he talks about Steph is a shooter. He's the greatest shooter of all time, which is true. Like he didn't really, he wasn't really the general of a team the same way Magic was or the same way CP3 was. Draymond played that role for them. And Steph got to run around screens being called the point guard position and shoot threes. So if you ask me like who the greatest point guard of all time is, it depends on your definition. And I'm going to take Chris Paul if we're talking about the floor general aspect. Like I truly believe that. The defense, the shot making, the passing. We all watched that series where he led the Pelicans against the Spurs, took them 7, and the Spurs were the eventual champs. I feel like people just underrate Chris Paul. I feel like the gap in the sense of a point guard is a lot smaller between Steph and Chris Paul, or at least it should be for like people having that conversation. Most people would say that the gap is huge between them. For me, Chris Paul's ahead, but if you're looking at it as another person, it should be smaller.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think you do bring up an interesting conversation. And I think it kind of goes back, Pete, to what we've talked about before on this channel, even about a guy like Jokic. I know I'm not putting Jokic in this conversation at all, just from a point that like we are now in this era of positionless basketball, right? Like everybody can play every single spot. There's no defined roles anymore. And so I think that this is a really tough question now. Because I don't think we can ever ask the question now of, is he the best point guard of all time? Because like you said, Brad, point guard, I think, has a specific definition. I think we need to start having conversations about who the best guard is in general.
Yeah, but then that's Jordan, right? Like that kind of invalidates the conversation in a lot of ways. It's tough. Because then if you start stretching what the definition of a point guard is like, I mean, I see. I don't even disagree with either of you guys. Like that's the hardest thing. You couldn't ever, with a straight face, say that Steph Curry is a better floor general than Chris Paul is, or Isaiah Thomas, or Magic Johnson. That's not even in the realm of reason. But he is doing the same. He's playing the same position in a completely different way, which is why, if we're going just their point guards on the roster sheet, it's got to be Steph. Because really, you think of the floor general as like let's use Chris Paul, right? He's bringing the ball up. He's primary ball handler. He's initiating every action on the court. He's doing the bulk of the strategic in-game adjustments. That's Chris Paul, right? He's doing it verbally and directly through having the ball. Steph Curry does a lot of that same exact stuff, except he does it non-verbally and without the ball. Him running around off screens, constantly moving off ball, is literally how their offense works. So in a certain sense, if you look at it through like a twisted prism of how you're seeing what a point guard is, they're really not doing too different of a job in terms of what they're bringing to the other 4 guys on the court. They're constantly making open looks happen for them that otherwise would not be there. And if you start to break it down, like they're the smallest guard on the court, they're playing the number 1, technically labeled that, and they initiate almost every offensive action, or the offense just flows through them. That's why I could never even remotely consider Chris Paul a better point guard than Steph, even though if we're labeling it as floor general, you're not wrong at all. But that's just us changing the definitions of, or I guess muddying up what the definition of a point guard is. This is why it's a hard conversation. It's more interesting than LeBron and Jordan.
Yeah. I mean, Drunk said in the chat that pure playmakers are dead. That's not true. Tyrese Halliburton is a pure playmaker.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that's a pretty good point because like Steph running around screens creates all the spacing for his team, and that's when you see like Draymond make a crazy zip pass to Clay who's back cutting, or Kevon Looney's wide open for some reason, and everyone's confused because 2 people followed Steph off of a screen.
Yep.
I thought they were gonna say kick him in the nuts,
bro.
Yeah.
That too.
that too. But those, think about that. What you just said is kind of like, in a certain way, if you're looking at it through that lens, Draymond making those passes, we've never seen him be able to do that without Steph. So by the logic of Chris Paul is one of the greatest floor generals, getting these guys open looks and stuff like that, I'd argue the first chain of all the open looks in Golden State's dynasty here is literally the attention that Steph Curry is bringing just by sheer virtue of how much of an offensive threat he is. It's just through a different means of getting there, Like those passing lanes might not have ever been open for Draymond if Steph wasn't who he is.
No, that's
kind of
true.
like it's kind of like
he also had
he's
Clay
just
too
giving
on the other side. who was
Agreed.
helping with
Yeah.
that gravity. I
Which
feel like, I mean, Steph's like, he has all the skill and he is the offensive engine, but he's also like a product of that system. You know what I mean? I'm not saying like he is the system for sure, but like having
yeah.
Clay next to him helped with the spacing, and then Draymond is a great passer, which helped like because if they don't have someone to make those reads and take advantage of the spacing, would you say the same thing that like Steph, like he kind of equates to a floor general that way?
I mean, based on what he's shown in his career, I would feel strange doubting that he couldn't have still done it. You know, like Clay is an amazing player. I'm not. No, I'm genuinely. I feel like most of what I'm coming across here is I'm taking away from Clay and Draymond, and I'm really not trying to. It's more just a matter of like I think a lot of those guys' best skills shine brightest because of the mere fact that they play with Steph Curry. I mean, he is unbelievably ahead of anybody else in the categories where he is the best at. Like it's not even comparable how much of a shooter he is compared to most of the league, right? I actually would question well before I questioned like anything about Steph. Like, would Clay have turned into Clay if he wasn't playing with Steph? Would Draymond have turned into Draymond if they weren't playing with Steph? Right? Like you just said, the system is Steph. That system doesn't exist if he is not who he is. So I don't know. It just depends on what your definition of a point guard is and how you look at like what the task is. I just more think of it like there are certain archetypes of every position. We
Yeah,
just happen to think of point guard in a very singular way. Like point
yeah,
guard,
the old
and that's
way.
the reason from the very beginning. Like Magic Johnson, it's hard to compare to him because he is the archetype of what we think of as a point guard. He is that. He's the logo, the Jerry West logo of point guards, basically, right? So guys like Steph that just play completely differently than him, it's hard to compare because they don't look anything like each other, like in terms of how they affect the game.
Yeah, I guess the one question I have though, Pete, is like your question is like if Magic Johnson wasn't on these teams, do these Lakers win those championships?
I mean, that's a super fair question, and I don't think they do. For just to be straight up, they probably don't. But at the same time, they had other Hall of Famers when the league was not anywhere near as deep as it is, right? I would actually be more questioning of like whether basketball would be as popular as it is now if it wasn't for Magic Johnson, more than would the Lakers have still been good. They probably still would have been one of the best teams in the league. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But he is still one of the greatest players of all time. So it's one of those sliding doors of like, I'm not necessarily trying to push him down. I'm just saying I'm raising Steph above him, I guess is how I'm looking at it.
Yeah, I mean it's a tough conversation just because I think there is a lot of like you said different aspects that we look at. You know, I mean, I think the issue sometimes too is that we didn't grow up with the Magic Johnson era.
Sure.
Like
Mm-hmm.
we didn't even watch him play. We didn't even watch him do any of that stuff. I think the last time he played was on that Redeem team, or sorry, the Dream team, and that was when he was not even as good as he was back then. So I think it's a very interesting conversation to have because as the years carry on, as the seasons carry on, there will obviously be better players. Positionless basketball is going there. Um, God, I just read that comment.
You are
Um,
definitely drunk. Don't ever say that again.
um,
I gotta look at it.
but yeah, I mean, it's tough to like neglect Magic Johnson, even just watching the highlights. Like, I think people forget like how good Magic Johnson was at Michigan State, but also just in the NBA. Just because, like we said, like we only see him through the highlights. We don't see him through the whole game. And maybe watching the game back in the '80s is a different feeling than what it was watching it now. So
Can we like pull up like a land of basketball side by side of Magic and Steph's accolades?
yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. I'd be curious to see because like here, let me just read off. This is just the first three guys on Magic Johnson's best teammates throughout his NBA career. Number one, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, like easily better than anybody Steph has ever played with. And I'm sorry, Kevin Durant is I'm trying not to count him as much because he only played there for a few seasons, but even then, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is better than Kevin Durant. He had James Worthy. James Worthy is one of the most underappreciated Hall of Famers ever in the history of basketball. Bob McAdoo is in the same boat. He was an NBA MVP in his prime. Like, again, not to take away from Clay and Draymond, those guys are better than Clay and Draymond were, well, relative to the era they were in. So I just think Steph is working with less.
You think so? Really? Man, I don't know.
I really think so. Like,
They won 73 games.
Yeah, but they won 73 games with like a roster of just people they drafted. Like, it wasn't like they had a bunch of nobody would have ever said Clay or Draymond was Hall of Famers going into that season. They were not Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or Bob McAdoo or James Worthy. And they had Magic Johnson there too, right? So you think of then comparing that, like Steph Curry, I don't know. I also then have to compare the eras of who they're playing against. Like Magic Johnson's greatest rival of all time is Larry Bird. I'm not taking anything away from Larry Bird.
Don't be dissing
I
Larry
would say,
Bird now.
I'm not. Hey, are you kidding me? Larry Bird he's on the Mount Rushmore of white people. He's there. I'm not taking it. I'm taking nothing away from him. This is a man that has lifted my race in terms of the sport I care about most. All right. My point is this: Steph Curry is going up against LeBron, right? We're not saying Larry Bird is LeBron, and Steph beat LeBron more times than not, right? So
Jumped
I don't
him, but
know.
yeah, I hear you.
As the biggest LeBron fan I know, other than you, Brad, I would, and Bernie, both of you. I'm a diehard LeBron fan. I just think like at that point, this is where I have to raise him up in terms of the competition that Steph is going up against is better than what Magic had to go against too.
That's a fair point. This drunk
Not in
said,
the
"Do you guys
not
see
in the way.
Drunk's recent comment?"
What did he say?
Kareem is definitely better than KD, bro. At least career wise. I mean, you could make an argument skill wise, but
That's.
you got to
I'm
respect people
sorry
playing in
that
their
drunk.
eras.
You must be on some good sauce tonight, my man.
Yeah.
Because KD in his wildest dreams, KD himself wouldn't say he's better than Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. There's no
Yeah.
shot he would say that. It's one of the great. He's literally one of the three greatest players ever in the league, as far as right
Yeah.
now is concerned.
Yeah. Here are the stats really quick I have for you, Brad. I put up Land of Basketball on the stream. So we have in terms of championships, Magic has 5, Curry has 4. NBA seasons, Curry has 14, Magic Johnson 13. So obviously Steph Curry's gonna have more seasons played. Playoffs played, Magic had 13, Steph Curry had 9. All-Star games, Steph Curry had 9, Magic had 12. Season MVPs, Magic had 3, Curry 2. Finals MVPs, Magic 3, Steph Curry 1. He really should have 2, but they won't give
Should
him
have
that one.
two.
He should have one.
You think Andre Iguodala was better than Steph
There's
Curry in that
no
playoff?
shot.
Yeah.
Come
Yeah.
on,
I
come
watched
on,
that playoffs.
Brad.
Bro, I watched. No, it's revisionist history to go back and say Steph deserved that, bro. People look at the numbers and are like, oh, yeah, Steph averaged whatever, 24 or whatever. He deserved it. And because he's Steph. But Andre was the one playing defense on LeBron who was torching them. Honestly, it should have gone to LeBron. But Andre was.
Yes, I agree with that.
It should have gone to LeBron.
We agree
You're
with
right.
that one.
We'll all agree on that. It was LeBron's award.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Andre was the primary defender on him. Andre, in that series, Andre shot better from 3 than Steph. Steph was a walking brick. Like, he could not hit a 3. He did it on less volume, but like that's what matters is actually making the shots. You don't get credit just for taking more threes.
Let's see here.
And,
All NBA teams. We have Magic with 10, Curry with 9. Scoring leader, Steph Curry had 2 scoring titles. Magic had none, but Magic Johnson did have 4 assist titles, and Steph Curry has had 0. Which
bro, Magic's accolades are nuts.
Oh, it's insane.
9
insane.
first teams, and Steph only has 4.
Yep.
Yeah, but
is that due to the level of competition rising in his
Well,
position though?
100%. 100.
You think so? Who has he lost first teams to? Like, I know he lost one to Luka.
Luka,
I mean,
probably Booker, maybe at some point. We'll have to look back at the history, but I mean, this is a really tough call. I mean, it's tough because like you said, Brad, like we have revisionist history. Like we're in the current era of Steph Curry right now. So we're oohing and awing about Steph Curry. But I think give this conversation about 10 more years when Curry's finally out of the league and there's been like his story is finally written. I think would be the right time to have that conversation again about like who really is the best player between the two, because I think it is a very interesting conversation because like you said, we view, at least I would say, the average NBA fan, just because of Twitter, and you know how I feel about the NBA Twitter sometimes. They still think that, and again, they weren't as good, I would say, as they're not as good as the players are today, but I would say that a lot of these older players get disrespected and called plumbers.
Yeah, that's not fair. I want to make clear. That's not what I'm saying. But there's no way, regardless of if you think they were plumbers or not. They're not, the league is not anywhere near as good back then as it is now. It's night and day.
Which is a fair point, but can we really take away points from those players back then for that? Like,
Of
or
course
can we?
of course we can't. That's why these conversations are so nonsense anyways, because
Very true.
really
Yeah, yeah.
it's apples and oranges. We're comparing like very different circumstances. Like if you put Steph, the version of Steph we had now back in that era of basketball, there would be a lot of people who would on the surface just immediately assume he's going to get absolutely clubbed to death, right? Like he's just going to get beaten up every game because it's so physical. That's wrong though, because he just would have been taking shots that nobody would have thought were ever going to go in. He would have broken the game back then, just more so than he did now. So, but that conversation doesn't mean anything because that can't happen, and neither can Magic Johnson play nowadays. I mean, Magic Johnson in today's basketball era, he would still be one of the best players in the league. So it's not to take anything away from him. I just think Steph, especially, and one of the things I want to clarify just before we move on, I'm not like a Steph Curry ride or die guy. Honestly, he's driven me crazy for most of his career. I just think like the nail in the coffin for me is that championship 2 seasons ago. Like that was really, really impressive. Like the fact that that team made it, I did not think they had another one left in them, to be frank with you guys. And maybe that was me being a fool at the time, but that was, I'll never doubt the dude ever again. If he is healthy and he has even moderately good teammates around him, they have a shot every season, even in today's era.
Yeah, I didn't think they had another one either. Shout out Andrew Wiggins. He really revived them with his energy.
True. Yep.
All right. Let us know in the comment section down below. What do you guys make of this conversation? Are you guys Team Steph? Are you guys Team Magic? Let us know in the comment section down below. Who do you guys think is the best NBA player between the two? Is it Steph Curry? Is it Magic Johnson? Let us know in the comment section down below.